Hey folks, in this video we're going to be learning how to insert dynamic tables into Google Docs using an unbounded Google App script. So what that means is we're going to be writing code that is going to take the data that you see in the spreadsheet in front of us, and it is going to generate a table that will be stylized and will dynamically respond to the values within the spreadsheet. So I'm taking you to my Google Drive and I am hitting run on a script that is going to produce a document called tables. And you'll notice that this document has a stylized table that also has a header and has all of the values that came out of our spreadsheet. Now, in the event that a new value was added to my spreadsheet, we could rerun our script and the result would be an updated table that responds to the new data entry. Similarly, this script will remove values that have been deleted. Now, I have not written into my script a value or a way to exclude null values, but you know what, maybe we'll do it on the fly now that we're talking about it. Cool. So when I say that we are going to be writing an unbounded script, that means we are not going to be using Google Apps Script within the extensions menu of Google Sheets. We are going to be using an unbounded app script that comes from the More section when you're selecting what type of Google Drive file type you'd like to create. So what I would recommend that you do is that you create a project folder so that you can store all of your materials together. My materials are existing in a subfolder of my video series folder. I already have that opened up here, and you can see that this file has the workbook that I want to collect data from. Once you have your file set up, go to the New icon, go to the More section, and then select Google App Script. Additionally, if you do not want to use an unbounded script, you can still use the Google App Script that is available to you within the extensions menu of the Google Sheet that has the data that you would like to work with. We're going to begin by adding a new file to our workbook. And this file is going to be a script that is called getSheetById. Now, if you've watched some of my previous videos, you know I like to construct a custom function called getSheetById. If you've watched my other videos, you might want to skip this part. I have timestamps in the description so that you can move on to the next part of the lesson. But if this is your first time here, you might want to watch this. getSheetById allows me to access values within spreadsheets by using the ID rather than the sheet name. So what we're going to do is we're going to create this function, and you can call it whatever you want to. I call it getSheetById, and we're going to pass in two arguments, the workbook ID and the sheet ID. Now you can call workbook underscore ID and sheet underscore ID anything you want to. I call these arguments those names so that I know what I'm referencing. We're going to go into the curly brackets, we're going to hit enter, and now we're going to declare a variable. And I like to call this variable WB, which is short for workbook. And this WB variable is going to call the spreadsheet app dot open by ID. We're going to open up our parentheses so that we can pass it a value. The value that we want to pass to it is going to be the WB underscore ID argument that we are passing as the first argument in our function. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to declare a variable for sheets. And these sheets are coming from the workbook that we are accessing via the workbook ID. And then we're going to get sheets. The reason that we're doing this is because we want to iterate through every single sheet that exists in the workbook that we are attempting to access. So in order to iterate, we need to use a loop. In this case, we're going to be using a for loop. We're going to open parentheses, and within that for loop, we're going to say I, which stands for iterator, but that I is a variable. So you can put in whatever you want to. You can put your name, you can put the letter A, you can put X, whatever you want to. I use I because frankly, that's what I've seen in all the tutorial videos that I've watched. So for I in Sheets, we're going to do a space, we're going to do a curly bracket, we're going to hit enter. We're now going to use an if statement, and we're going to say if Sheets square brackets I. From now on, Sheets square bracket I is going to be referenced as Sheets iterator. So every time I say Sheets iterator, enter in Sheets square bracket I square bracket. If Sheets iterator dot getSheetId, my apologies, open parentheses, is equal to, now we're going to be referencing the second argument in our function, which is the sheet ID. Space, curly brackets, enter. If the Sheets iterator matches the sheet ID that is passed into our function, we want to return the Sheets iterator name. So we're going to store that in a variable called sheet name. And we're going to have that set equal to Sheets iterator dot get sheet name. We're going to leave our if, where you can see we're on the outside of our if statement here because those two brackets are colored. We're on the outside of our for loop. You can see those brackets are colored. We hit enter, and now you can see we're back into the main portion of our function, which means we've left our if statement and we've left our for loop. Now we're going to use the word return, and we're going to reference that WB variable for the last time, and we're going to say get sheet by name, and then we're going to pass it the sheet name variable that we just created. And now we have a function that will allow us to access a workbook and a sheet using their IDs. The reason that we do this is because names are some of the most volatile forms of data that you will come into contact with. In the event that you use getSheetByName and you hard code in a static value or a static string or a static string object, and that value changes, your script will break. If you use the sheet ID, it will not change. And the function that we've composed here will leverage the ID in order to get the sheet name, which makes it dynamic, robust, and stable for development. If you want to learn more about this, I have a video that I will link up in the description that is all about data collection using the sheet ID. Cool. So now we're going to go back to our main file, and we are going to start collecting the spreadsheet ID and the sheet ID. So our first line is going to be a constant, and that is going to be the workbook ID. And we're going to have that set to a string. Then we're going to declare a constant for sheet one capital ID, and we're going to set that to 0. We're going to go to whatever workbook we want to use, and we are going to go to the URL, and we're going to go to the portion after this docs.google.com/spreadsheet/d/. After that string, we're going to collect our ID number. That's what this portion of the URL is. It's the unique workbook ID. So we're going to collect that value, and then we're going to paste it into our workbook ID constant. Now, we don't have to collect anything if we're using sheet 1 ID. For your information, every single time that you create a spreadsheet in Google Sheets or in Google Drive, the ID of sheet 1 is always going to be 0. So if we create a new sheet over here, you see that we have a unique sheet ID. In the event that you are not using sheet 1, meaning that the GID that you have in the upper right hand of the URL is not 0, all you have to do is just copy whatever the value is of the sheet that you're using after hash GID equals. That's the sheet ID. So you can see I've added that in there. We have the values that we need, and now we can start writing our code. We're going to begin by writing function. I like to call this main. We're not going to pass it any variables or any arguments. We are going to use variables, but we're not going to use any arguments in our function. So we're just going to have a blank parentheses there. Then we're going to add curly brackets, and we're going to hit enter, and we're going to start coding. So we're going to begin by declaring a variable called DataSheet. And this is going to be where we use our getSheetById function that we just created. And you can see this function requires 2 arguments in order to run. In our case, it's a workbook ID. So now we're going to pass in our workbook ID constant, and then it's a sheet ID. So we're going to pass in sheet 1 ID. Now we are going to access the data within our spreadsheet. So we're going to do var data equals datasheet.getRange. And then we're going to start at row 1, column 1, and then we're going to reference datasheet.getLastRow, parentheses, and then we're going to do datasheet.getLastColumn. So this is how we dynamically collect data. By referencing 1 for the row and 1 for the column means that we are starting in the first row of the first column. The third argument is then stating how many rows we're supposed to go. So what getLastRow is doing is it's literally counting that there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 rows that it needs to go. And then getLastColumn is doing 1, 2, 3. The result is that we have a programmatic way using getRange to start at row 1, column 1, go down 5 rows, and across 3 columns. That's exactly what we just did here, but we used 2 programmatic functions, getLastRow and getLastColumn, in order to dynamically see how our range expands and contracts. If your data table does not start at row 1, then you just need to change it to whatever row it starts. If your range does not start in column 1, then you have to do the same thing. Now it gets a little bit challenging because if you're not starting at row 1, you're going to have to use math functions. So you're going to have to subtract the rows from getLastRow and getLastColumn. We're not going to get bogged down in that. But if that is a problem that you're experiencing, reach out in the comments section and I'll be sure to walk you through how to solve that problem. Cool. So before we're done with our data variable, we are going to get display values. Now you'll notice when you do .getDisplay that there's a getDisplayValue and a values. If your range, such as a table, has more than 1 value, you have to use getDisplayValues. Otherwise, you're going to get an error because it's only going to be able to pull in 1 data point. Cool. So now what we're going to do is logger.log, and we're going to do data, that variable that we just wrote, and we're going to run our script. Now, this is a really good time to, and there we go, there's a little error there. Anyway, this is a really good time to run because you have to provide permissions to your unbounded script in order to access the sheet so that it can read, write, update, delete values. The same thing happens if you use a bounded script. Google Apps Script requires you to provide permissions like this so that you don't allow somebody access to your data. And now you can see that we've successfully pulled in all of the data values that exist in our sheet. So we can move on to the next step of the process, which is going to be document creation. So I'm going to add in a comment here, and I'm going to say create the doc. And we are going to create a variable for doc create. I use this name. You can use whatever name you want to. And I'm going to do document app create, and this is where you can enter in the name of your new document. For me, it's going to be tables. Then I'm going to do a var for doc, which is going to reference that lowercase, doc create variable, and I am going to get body. The next thing I'm going to do is set a variable for index that is going to be 0. I broke down this in another video of mine, which will be linked in the description, but effectively what you have to do is you have to use the document app in order to create the document. And then in order to access the body of the document, you have to use the getBody method. Google Docs are structured in 3 sections: header, body, footer. We are not going to be doing anything with the footer or the header in this video, so that's why we are creating a variable that accesses the body. The reason that I'm creating an index that is set to 0 is because the way that documents are structured is such that you have to reference the child index of the body that you are sending data to, or you are creating page elements in. And using a variable set to 0 allows you to iterate on that so that you do not have to hard code child elements to the document. Again, I explained this further in some of my other videos. I'm going to do my best to kind of touch on it in this one, but if you kind of want a deeper dive into it, go check out some of the older stuff. Cool. So what we're going to do now is we're going to add a header to like say this is where our table is, and then we are going to add the table to the body. So create header and build table. So we're going to create var, and we are going to call this header, and we are going to reference that doc variable that we created on line 12, and we are going to insert paragraph, and we are going to reference our index variable, and we're going to do a comma, and we're going to call this whatever we want to. I'm going to call this app script table. You can type whatever you want to. Then we are going to set heading, and we are going to reference DocumentApp dot paragraph heading dot, and then you can pick whatever heading you want to. I like heading 2, so that's what I'm going to use. We're going to go to the right of the parentheses. We're going to use a semicolon, and then we're going to do index plus plus semicolon. Then we're going to do a variable for table, and we are going to have that set to doc.insert table, and we're going to open a parentheses, and we are going to add in index, and then we are going to reference our data, and then we're going to use a semicolon, and we're going to do index plus plus semicolon. Cool. So now what we're going to do is we're going to test this out, and we're probably going to have to give access to Google Docs, or DocumentApp, sorry. This is probably the most entertaining portion of all of my videos. Cool, so we're going to allow we're going to allow access to all that stuff, and hopefully we see successful document creation. Awesome. So now we're going to go back. You see that we have a document called tables, and now you can see that we have a header for app script, and then you see that we got our table in here. Awesome. Now, the only problem is that it's not stylized. It's just literally the wireframe of the table. So we're going to go back to our script, and actually before we do that, I'm going to delete my doc. Cool. And we're going to go back to our script. And now what we're going to do is add in those style elements. So we're going to go down a row, and we're going to say, you know what, let's start with create style for header row. So basically what's going to happen is we're going to make this like dark gray, and we're going to bold the text. So we're going to create a variable for header style. We're going to do curly brackets, and then we are going to reference the header style dictionary that we just built, and we're going to use square brackets, and we're going to reference DocumentApp, and then attribute, and then all caps bold, and we are going to set this to true. Now, this is probably the most complicated, that was probably the most complicated thing to explain. I don't totally understand why you need to create dictionaries and then individually push in the style elements. That's just what Google Docs' documentation said. So I'm just following the documentation on what you need to do there. Again, if you're having any problems with that, reach out in the comments and we can talk about it. I love it when you interact with me there and you raise your questions. So don't be shy. The next thing that we're going to do is we're going to colorize our header row. So in order to add style elements to the table, we're going to have to loop through each row of the table. So we're going to use a for loop, and we're going to use I for iterator in data, and then we're going to use square bracket 0 just to reference the first row. We're going to use a curly bracket, we're going to hit enter, and then we're going to reference our table, and we're going to say get row, and we're going to use a parentheses and then enter in 0 because we just want to reference the first row of the table. 0 is the first row. Row 1 is 0, row 2 is 1. It's a little bit confusing, but you get the hang of it. Dot get cell, and then we're going to reference the iterator because we want to loop through each cell of each column of the first row, and that's what get cell is doing. It's literally going from cell 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 like that. And then we're going to set the background color, and we're going to use a parentheses. This has to be formatted in hex coding. So if you don't know hex codes, all you have to do is go to your Google Sheet and pick a color. In my case, I want to use this dark gray. So I'm just going to color that cell even though it doesn't matter. And then I'm going to click this add custom color. And then this is where you get your hex code. And this is where you get the RGB values. There are some other environments that require RGB. So we're just going to copy this hex code here from Google Sheets, and we're going to go back to our document, and this has to be passed in as a string. So we're just going to paste it in like that. And you know what? Why don't we, oh no, sorry. We have to also set the attributes, and then we're going to pass it header style, which is what's going to apply that header dictionary, or that variable dictionary that we created where we set the attribute to bold and true and all that stuff. So let's run this. Let's cross our fingers and hope it works. I feel pretty good that it will, but let's see what happens. Cool. So we got some stuff here. And check it out. Now we have a gray first row where the text is bold. It's starting to look really great. Cool. So last thing that we are going to do is we are going to add in alternate coloring so that some of the rows are white, some of the rows are a light gray. So in order to do that, we're going to add a comment that says add alternate coloring. And we are going to have to use, we're going to have to loop through each of the rows, and we're going to have to identify if the row is even or odd. And then if it's even, we want it to do something. If it's odd, we want it to do something. So we're going to use 2 for loops, one that's going to loop through the rows, and another for loop that is going to loop through the columns. Then we're going to use an if statement to say if the row is even, do something. And then we're going to use an else so that if it is not even, it does something else. Cool, that was a lot of words. Let's start doing some typing. So we're going to start for, and we are going to use a new way of doing loops where we are going to write out the word var I, and we're going to set it equal to 1. The reason for that is because we want to start at 1. We don't want to start at 0. So we're going to do var I is greater than or equal to data.length minus 1 I plus plus. We're going to do curly bracket. Then we're going to do another for loop. I know, it's a lot, sorry. Now we're going to do for j in data 0, because we just want to do it in the first row. We want to just like loop through the column through the table value, or sorry, through the column value. So we just have to use the header to get like the number of columns there. There's probably a better way to do it, or like other ways to do it. This is just how I did it. So if you have other ways, drop it in the comments section so that people can get it. Cool. So now we're going to use our if statement, and we're going to say if I, and then we're going to use the percentage sign too. So that's basically saying if I is not an even number. And then we are going to use a curly bracket, and we are going to say table.getRow, and then we're going to use a parentheses, and we're going to reference I. And then we are going to use getCell and reference J. And then we are going to set background color, and then we are going to use, actually, you know what? Let's just use these, because I think this is light gray. So we'll just copy that value from the documentation. It's just all Fs. Oops, sorry, my bar over there got in the way. No, now we got the note there. Oh, folks, we're almost there. Sorry. Okay, cool. So we got all of our Fs there. And now we're going outside of our if statement. It's done. We're going to hit enter. And you know what? I'm going to add in some line breaks here so you can actually see what I'm doing. So sorry that this has gotten so messy. We're going to do else. We're going to do space. We're going to do curly bracket. We're going to hit enter. And now we're just going to do basically the exact same thing we just did. We're going to do table.getRow, reference I. Then we're going to do getCell. We're going to reference J. And then we're going to set background color. And then we have to figure out, you know what, I have it up here. It's just hash F3, F3, F3. Cool. So let's hit save. Let's hit run. Let's go back here. You can see we now have a new document written here. And voila. We have a header row, or we have a header, and then we have a stylized header row, and then we have alternating colors in our table. Wonderful. Now the true test is going to be what happens when we get rid of that, when we add new values in here. So let's do David, who lives in Maryland and has a phone number of 1111 111. Cool. So let's hit run. You can see David came into our data set. And check it out. We got this updating table. Now let's see what happens when we get rid of people. There's our new doc. Cool. Now we got a nice tight table in there. So to recap, what we did today was we learned how to write an unbounded Google Apps script that dynamically inserts tables into Google Documents. We are referencing a Google Sheet so that we can collect our data, and then we are processing it so that it appears within a brand new Google document called Tables. I hope you all found this helpful. Like I said, I have a couple videos that are going to be linked up in the description if you want to learn more about some of the topics that we covered today. I really appreciate the feedback that I've been getting. I really enjoy hearing from you and what your journeys are and stuff that you find helpful or stuff that you'd like to find help with. So please continue to reach out. And also, if you see me do something silly in here, or if you have another way of doing it, please share it in the comments. I'm sharing this because it's how I know how to do things or how I prefer to do things, but it doesn't mean that's the only way to do it. So I think we all get better when we, work together, and I hope you'll share any insights that you have that I might have missed. Cool. Thanks. I hope you enjoyed the video, and hopefully I'll see you in the next one.